In the quiet town of Marlow Ridge, life seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Streets lined with oak trees, houses with white fences, and neighbors who waved every morning painted the image of a perfect small-town life. David Kearns had built his home on the far edge of this town, away from the busier streets, in a place where the nights were still and the mornings greeted him with the sound of distant birds. His life was built on order. Every tool in his garage had its place. Every bill was paid on time, and every evening followed a familiar routine. For years, that predictability had been a source of comfort, especially in his marriage to Julia. She was bright, warm, and quick to laugh and together. They had shaped a life that, at least from the outside, looked unshakable. People often said they were the kind of couple others wanted to be: steady, committed, and free of the drama that seemed to plague others. But the truth had started to shift in ways David couldn't ignore. Julia's laugh came less often now. Her eyes seemed to be somewhere else when he spoke, and small, unexplained absences began creeping into her days. She would come home later than usual, offering vague explanations about meetings that ran long or last-minute plans with friends he had never met. At first, David gave her the benefit of the doubt. Marriage, he believed, was about trust, and he had no reason to think she would betray his. But the silences between them grew heavier, and even the familiar comfort of their shared routines began to feel like a facade. He noticed she had started keeping her phone close, never leaving it on the counter when she went to another room, and quickly swiping away messages if he walked past. The small gestures spoke volumes, even if no words were exchanged. David wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but he was observant. He had built his life on careful attention to detail, and now, those same instincts that had made him meticulous in his work were telling him something was wrong. He didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation was messy, unpredictable, and left too much to chance. He preferred certainty, and certainty required proof. So he began to watch. Not in an obvious way. He didn't trail her every move or question her at every turn, but in the quiet, unnoticed ways that gather information without raising suspicion. He noted the change in the perfume she wore, the faint scent lingering long after she returned home. He paid attention to the places she claimed to have been, cross-checking them with subtle observations. Once, she mentioned spending the evening with a coworker, but David noticed the tires of her car had the faint dust of the back roads outside of town, nowhere near the restaurant she claimed to visit. The more he noticed, the clearer the picture became. His mind began to drift in the evenings, imagining where she might be when she wasn't with him. He would sit at the kitchen table after dinner, the ticking of the wall clock filling the silence, and think about how quickly something stable could start to crack. The house they had built together felt different, now not unsafe, but unfamiliar, as though it no longer belonged entirely to him. He still kept his routine, still rose at dawn and kept the lawn trimmed to perfection. But beneath that surface calm, he was already preparing himself for the possibility that the life he thought he had was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. By the time the leaves began to turn that year, David had already made a quiet decision. If Julia was hiding something from him, he would find out on his own terms. He wouldn't rely on her words because words could lie. He would rely on the truth he uncovered himself, no matter how much it hurt to see. It started with the smallest of clues, fragments that could have meant nothing on their own, but began to weave together into something undeniable. One evening, David was taking out the trash when he noticed a crumpled receipt tucked in the side pocket of Julia's car door. It was from a restaurant in the next town over, a place neither of them had ever been together. The total was for 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, and dessert. He told himself it could have been a business lunch, but the date on the receipt was a Friday night, the same night she had claimed to be having coffee with a friend. Another time, he caught the faint trace of a cologne he didn't recognize on her scarf, one that didn't match anything he owned. The scent was subtle but lingered in his memory for days, a quiet reminder that something was out of place. Then came the photograph, posted casually on her social media, where she was smiling at the camera. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the edge of a man's shoulder. The angle was wrong for it to be a passerby. Whoever it was had been close comfortable. The unease grew heavier. David didn't allow himself to spiral into suspicion without evidence, so he began to pay closer attention. He noticed she often parked her car in a different spot when she came home later than usual, as though avoiding the glare of the porch light. Her phone, once left on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was now always within reach. She began answering messages in the bathroom or stepping outside for quick calls. It was subtle, but it was a shift, and David recognized shifts for what they were. One late night in early winter, he decided to follow her. He stayed several cars behind, keeping his headlights dim so she wouldn't notice. She drove out of Marlow Ridge and into the darker back roads that led toward the edge of the county. The destination was a dimly lit parking lot behind a closed cafe, the kind of place that wouldn't draw attention at night. From his vantage point, David watched her park and step out, glancing around briefly before a man appeared from the shadows. He was tall, with a confident stride, and when they embraced, it was not the casual greeting of friends. They walked together toward a side entrance of the cafe. Disappearing into the dark, David stayed in his car, the engine off, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The seconds passed slowly, stretching into minutes, then into an hour. The cold air seeped into the cabin, but he didn't move. He didn't storm in. He didn't call her. Instead, he sat in the quiet, letting the reality settle in until it felt solid and undeniable. When the door finally opened again, Julia and the man stepped out, lingering near the entrance before parting ways. She walked back to her car with the kind of casual ease that suggested nothing had happened. While the man disappeared into the night, David followed her home but kept his distance, ensuring she never saw his truck in the rearview mirror. Once inside their house, Julia greeted him as if nothing was amiss, her voice light, her face composed. He responded in kind, neither cold nor warm, just steady. Later that night, when she had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table and began writing. He listed the date, the time, the location, and every detail he could remember. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction. It was the beginning of a record, a log of her movements and patterns. Each entry brought him closer to something he wasn't sure he wanted to see, but he refused to look away. This wasn't about jealousy anymore, it was about clarity. And clarity, he knew, would require patience. Weeks slipped by, and the pages in David's notebook began to fill with a precision that mirrored the way he had always approached life. Dates, times, street names, even the weather on certain nights were recorded in neat, measured handwriting. What had started as scattered observations had grown into a map lines connecting locations, notes on patterns, and small details that might seem meaningless to someone else but told David a larger story. He now knew exactly when Julia left the house, how long she stayed away, and which routes she preferred when meeting the man. The man's identity hadn't been a mystery for long. Through careful observation and a bit of quiet research, David learned his name, Ethan Maris. He was a contractor who had been working on a property renovation not far from Julia's office. A man in his mid-30s with a polished confidence that suggested he was used to being noticed. David found out where he lived, a small apartment above a hardware store, and where he liked to spend his evenings. It wasn't difficult to piece together. Ethan wasn't hiding. He moved through the world without caution, as though certain no one was watching. David, on the other hand, moved in silence. His evenings were spent in the garage, a space that had always been his sanctuary. Julia thought he was working on small home repairs, just another part of his meticulous nature. In reality, he was preparing. The workbench that once held tools for fixing leaky faucets and building shelves now held other items, A pair of gloves with a smooth, non-porous surface, a flashlight small enough to fit in a pocket, and a lockpick set he had quietly ordered online. He kept these things out of sight, not because he feared discovery. Julia rarely entered the garage, but because the act of hiding them made his intentions more deliberate. In his mind, he had already crossed a line. This wasn't about catching her in the act anymore. This wasn't about confronting her or pleading for the truth. It had become about control, taking the situation out of her hands entirely. The idea of a confrontation seemed pointless. Words could be twisted, tears could be faked, and excuses could be spun into something resembling truth. Action, however, left no room for manipulation. As the days passed, David began following Ethan as well. Not every day, just enough to learn his habits without risking being noticed. He discovered the gym Ethan attended twice a week, the bar he stopped at on Thursdays, and the jogging path he used early on weekend mornings. David even learned which nights Ethan stayed home, the lights in his apartment glowing until after midnight. The more David knew, the more he felt a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't a whirlwind of rage or jealousy. It was something colder, sharper, an unshakable clarity that left no room for second thoughts. By late winter, the plan in his head had become as detailed as the notes in his book. He knew where he could approach without witnesses, where cameras wouldn't see, and where shadows offered enough cover to vanish into the night. He never wrote these parts down. The written notes were for the facts. The rest stayed in his head. Locked away, Julia went about her life as though nothing had changed. She smiled when she needed to, sent polite texts during the day, and returned home with the same easy routine. But David could see it now, the way she seemed lighter when she thought he wasn't looking, as though she carried a secret that made her feel free. What she didn't know was that the secret wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to him now, too. And with that knowledge came the weight of a decision he had already made. The night David had been waiting for came without warning. Julia mentioned over dinner that she was meeting a friend for drinks, her tone casual, her eyes avoiding his for just a moment too long. She left shortly after, wearing the same perfume he had smelled on her scarf weeks before, the scent drifting through the air even after the door closed. David waited 5 minutes before leaving himself, his truck idling quietly as he pulled out of the driveway and slipped into the same route she had taken. He kept a careful distance, headlights dim, his pace steady so as not to draw attention. The roads grew darker as they moved toward the edge of town, streetlights becoming sparse until only the pale glow of the moon lit the asphalt. Julia's car finally turned into a narrow gravel drive, leading to a small, weathered motel just outside the county line. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, paint peeling from the walls, a neon vacancy sign flickering in the cold air. David parked a short distance away, hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges. The air was sharp, his breath visible in the faint light. He waited, his eyes fixed on the motel entrance. Minutes later, another car arrived, a sleek black sedan that he recognized instantly. Ethan stepped out, looking around briefly before heading toward one of the far rooms. He moved with the same unhurried confidence David had seen before, as though the world bent itself around his presence. David didn't move right away. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and every second now had to be measured. He slipped on the gloves he kept tucked into his jacket, their smooth surface cold against his skin. In his pocket, the small flashlight and a length of cord sat beside the other items he had chosen carefully for this night. He stepped out of his truck, closing the door with the gentlest push to avoid noise. He approached the motel from the side, keeping to the shadows cast by the dim exterior lights. The ground was uneven, gravel crunching softly under his boots as he moved. He reached the back of the building, where an emergency exit door hung slightly ajar. He had noticed it on an earlier visit when scouting the location. It was the only point of entry not visible from the road. Pushing it open just enough to slip through, he found himself in a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of mildew. The sound of low voices came from the second door on the right. He didn't need to hear the words to know who was inside. His steps were silent as he approached, stopping just outside the thin wooden door. The cheap motel walls did little to mask the faint sounds from within, the rustle of movement, the muffled thud of something being set down. His breathing slowed, his mind narrowing to a single focus. The rest unfolded in silence. No one in the motel saw him enter, and no one saw him leave. There were no raised voices, no shouts to draw attention, only the sound of the door closing softly behind him when it was over. Outside, the cold night air felt different now, sharper and strangely still. David walked back to his truck with the same steady pace he had arrived with, slipping the gloves into his pocket before starting the engine. As he pulled away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror at the flickering neon sign of the motel, shrinking in the distance. By the time he reached Marlow Ridge, the roads were empty, and the town slept unaware of what had just happened beyond its borders. In his mind, there was no turning back. What had been set in motion was now complete. For the next few days, Marlow Ridge carried a quiet tension, the kind that settles over a place when something has gone wrong, but no one knows exactly what. Ethan Maris was nowhere to be found. His car had been discovered abandoned near the Bay River, parked at an odd angle on a patch of dirt beside the boat launch. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside were his wallet, phone, and a set of keys, all neatly arranged on the passenger seat. It didn't look like the scene of a robbery or an accident. It looked deliberate, as though someone had left them there to be found. The police came to Julia first. They asked about her connection to Ethan, how long she had known him, and when she had last seen him. She denied knowing him well, brushing it off as casual encounters through work. But the questions didn't stop there, and David noticed the way her voice wavered when she repeated her answers. She was nervous, not because she suspected what had really happened, but because she feared the truth of her affair might surface. The officers left with polite nods, but their eyes said they weren't convinced. News traveled quickly in town. People whispered in grocery store aisles, speculating about what might have happened. Some said Ethan had run off to escape debts, others that he had gotten into trouble with someone dangerous. But no one had any proof, and without proof, all they had were rumors. David moved through these days with an unsettling calm. He went to work as usual, maintained his routines, and avoided long conversations at home. Julia seemed more on edge than he was, flinching at sudden knocks on the door or unexpected phone calls. She didn't know he had been there that night, and she certainly didn't know what he had done. But she could sense something had shifted between them. His gaze held a weight now, one she couldn't read, but couldn't ignore. In the evenings, David spent time in the garage. The low hum of the small fan masked other, quieter sounds. He kept the door closed, and Julia never came out to check on him. Whatever he was doing in there remained his alone, the air thick with a damp, metallic smell that never reached the house. The investigation stretched on for weeks before it began to fade. The police found no solid leads, no evidence to connect anyone to Ethan's disappearance. With no witnesses and no signs of foul play they could prove, the case was quietly set aside. It became one of those unsolved mysteries that lived on in the background of small-town gossip, resurfacing only when someone mentioned his name. Life in Marlow Ridge returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. But inside the Kearns household, nothing was the same. Julia no longer stayed out late, no longer smiled at her phone when she thought David wasn't looking. She had grown quieter, as though some part of her had been closed off. David never confronted her about the affair, never spoke the words aloud, but his silence was its own form of communication. It told her enough. At night, when the house was still, David sometimes sat alone in the living room, staring out the window at the empty street. He didn't feel regret. He didn't feel pride either. What he had done was simply a conclusion, an ending to something that had already been falling apart. The world saw him as a quiet, dependable man, and that was exactly how he intended to keep it. The truth was locked away, deep enough that no one would ever touch it. Julia never asked him what he knew, and he never offered. But in the space between them, there was an unspoken understanding. Whatever had happened to Ethan Maris was not a question worth asking. Asterisk, here's Chapter 6 continuing the tone, pacing, and style of the story. The months that followed were marked by an uneasy quiet. Life in Marlow Ridge moved on as if nothing had happened. Yet for David, every day carried the weight of a secret too large to ever be spoken aloud. The case of Ethan Maris had faded into the background of town gossip, a story retold less and less often as new events replaced it. But in certain moments, a glance from a neighbor, a passing comment at the hardware store, David felt the faint ripple of suspicion. Like a shadow brushing past. Julia seemed changed in ways she didn't fully acknowledge. She no longer stayed out late, no longer kept her phone glued to her side, and her smile, when it appeared, was smaller, almost guarded. She treated David with a careful politeness, as though afraid of stepping into territory she couldn't control. But David noticed her eyes sometimes drifted toward him when she thought he wasn't looking, as if trying to read something in his expression that wasn't there. The garage remained his private domain. Julia never entered it, never asked what he did there in the evenings. Inside, everything was as he liked it, tools lined in precise order, drawers closed with measured care, and a single locked cabinet that held items he would never display openly. He had grown used to the solitude of that space. The way the hum of the small fan and the faint smell of oil and metal seemed to settle his thoughts. One evening in early spring, David noticed a black sedan parked at the far end of the street. It wasn't a car he recognized, and its tinted windows reflected the late sun like dark mirrors. It was gone by the time night fell, but its presence left a mark in his mind. Over the next week, he saw it again, sometimes idling near the park, sometimes slowly passing by his house before disappearing around the corner. On the 7th day, it was there when he returned from work, parked across the street from Mrs. Turner's driveway. David didn't slow down. He pulled into his garage, closed the door, and waited by the window until the car finally drove away. That night, he went back to his notebook. It had been weeks since he'd written in it, but the habit returned: easily date, time, and a short description of the car. He kept the entry short, but he knew he would be watching closely. The police hadn't visited in months, but their absence didn't mean the case was forgotten. David understood how these things worked sometimes. Silence was the space before a question was asked again. Whether the sedan belonged to them or to someone else entirely, it was a reminder that even when a story fades, it's never truly over. Julia, perhaps sensing his distraction, asked him once if everything was all right. He told her it was. She didn't press. In her own way, she had learned not to chase answers she didn't want to hear. The air between them was steady now, but it was not the same steadiness they had once shared. It was a fragile balance, one that could shift with the smallest change. Late one night, long after Julia had gone to bed, David stood at the front window, watching the street. It was empty, still, lit only by the yellow wash of the street lamp. He stayed there for a long time, scanning the shadows, waiting for a shape to emerge. It didn't come, but he knew it would. Some things didn't end just because you wanted them to. They lingered, circling back when you least expected them. And when they did, David would be ready.